Hey, Jordan here, and I'm welcoming you back to episode number 2 of the Nickospective podcast, where I give my commentary and perspective on everything Nickelodeon. You may remember how I did my introductory podcast several months back, but I figure we're long overdue for another treat. So today I'm going to be talking to you about Dan Schneider, who, if you don't know who he is, he produced a lot of live action shows for Nickelodeon, including All That and Keenan and Kell back in the 90s, as well as The Amanda Show, Drake and Josh, Zoey 101, Victorious, iCarly, Sam and Cat, and even some of the newer shows that are on Nickelodeon now. For example, we have a superhero show called Henry Danger, and we have one of my favorite all-time shows that I'm just getting into called Game Shakers, and I'll explain to you each a little bit about each show as we go on. But throughout the podcast today, I want to give you a history of Dan Schneider and his contributions to the Nickelodeon network, and a little bit about his legacy as well as the legacy of the actors that he worked with. Some of them have already rose to fame and popularity doing great things outside of Nickelodeon. Dan Schneider was born on January 14th, 1966 in Memphis, Tennessee, and he actually began his career as an actor. In the 80s, he starred in many different movies, including such ones as Better Off Dead, Making the Grade, The Big Picture, Happy Together, and Hot Resort. It wasn't until 1986 when he moved to television to make his TV acting debut, where he starred in an ABC sitcom by the name of Head of the Class. This show ran for 5 seasons from 1986 to 1991. 2 years later, he moved on to another show called Home Free, and in 1994, he played a character by the name of Sean Eckhart in a TV movie called Tanya Nancy, The Inside Story, which detailed the controversial scandal between figure skaters Tanya Harding and Nancy Kerrigan in the 1994 Winter Olympics. It wasn't until the late 80s, though, when Dan Schneider co-hosted the second annual Nickelodeon Kids' Choice Awards in 1988. It was at that time when he hooked up together with a development executive for Nickelodeon by the name of Albie Hecht. And at the time, Nickelodeon was looking for a sketch comedy show to replace 2 shows, actually. You Can't Do That on Television and Roundhouse. You Can't Do That on Television ended in 1990, and Roundhouse was canceled in 1992. Yep, so it was around this same time frame where Albie Hecht, who was working at Nickelodeon at the time, along with Dan Schneider and Brian Robbins, who actually were co-stars on Head of the Class at the time, the 3 became very close friends. It turned out that Dan Schneider's co-hosting of the 1988 Kids' Choice Awards provided Hecht with an opportunity to ask him, as well as Brian Robbins, to pitch a show that would replace the 2 sketch comedy shows, You Can't Do That on Television and Roundhouse, that just were canceled. But at the time, Schneider and Robbins declined his offer because they were still doing the Head of the Class show. But when Head of the Class was canceled in 1991, Dan Schneider, along with Brian Robbins and Mike Tollin, who actually went on to form their own production company at this time, began to put their heads together and come up with a possible idea for a new show that they could pitch to Nickelodeon. At first, they were running on a low budget, and they ended up starting with producing a half-hour documentary which featured hosts from Nickelodeon, Phil Moore and Mike O'Malley, as a comedy tour. The premise of this half-hour documentary was essentially to drive across the country and perform various comedy acts. They sent this to Nickelodeon. They were impressed. In 1993, Albie Hecht and Nickelodeon decided to greenlight the show, and Dan Schneider, Brian Robbins, and Mike Tollin now had to decide where to go from here. It was Brian Robbins who now stepped up and suggested, hey, let's do a sketch comedy show that is the equivalent of Saturday Night Live, SNL, for kids. They were influenced by previous shows that were on the air, such as the Carol Burnett Show, Nickelodeon's previous sketch comedy show, You Can't Do That on Television, and a show called Laugh-In. And they all thought it was a good idea and decided to write and shoot a pilot episode in 1994. But before they could shoot the pilot, they needed a cast. So they went out and conducted a nationwide talent search to find the best kids for the job to really take off with the show. They eventually nailed it down to 8 actors and actresses who would star in the initial pilot. Those 8 names were Angelique Bates, Lori Beth Denberg, Katrina Johnson, Kel Mitchell, Elisa Reyes, Josh Server, and Kenan Thompson. Names that by now I am sure I were all familiar with. These 8 kids would then launch their careers as child stars as the original cast of the new show for Nickelodeon, now called All That. Filming and production for the pilot episode began on January 17th, 1994 at Nickelodeon Studios in Universal Studios, Orlando, Florida. And interesting fun fact, there was an earthquake that was going on, and the production team needed to decide whether or not they wanted to shoot despite the natural disaster that was going on. But in the end, they decided to go with it, shoot anyway, despite what had happened earlier with the earthquake. So they shot the pilot, they had the cast in place, but unfortunately after the pilot aired, it wasn't received very well in the beginning. Nickelodeon showed All That to test audiences consisting of kids from various genders and age groups, and they didn't really enjoy the show that much. But regardless, the president of the network at the time, whose name was Geraldine Laybourne, went ahead and gave the All That production team the go-ahead to start the series for its first full season. The first episode of All That as the regular series premiered on December 24th, yes, Christmas Eve of 1994. All That was later part of the Saturday night lineup that Nickelodeon branded as Snick, and it really became a success. It ran for 10 seasons, and there were a lot of very notable sketches, characters, and cast members, and it would take me a lot of time to name them all. But some of the notable sketches and characters, of course, included things like Good Burger, the Delmont Junior High School, involving characters such as Miss Fingerly, played by Lori Beth Denberg, along with Principal William Baines Pimpel. He was portrayed by Kenan Thompson. And then, of course, we have Coach Cretin, played by Kel Mitchell. And then we had the Ask Ashley segment starring Amanda Bynes, who had joined the cast in season 3 before going on to doing the Amanda Show, which I will get into later. Then, of course, we had Vital Information with Lori Beth Denberg, then Danny Tamborelli, and later Lil JJ. And a whole bunch of sketches, whatever, Cooking with Randy and Mandy, along with so many other notable sketches that really defined 90s TV, or at least for Nickelodeon, and have become favorites that I'm sure you and I can still remember to this day. Dan Schneider was one of the show's producers. He started out along with Heath Seifert and Kevin Coppolo, who many of you remember as the stage manager who would come in at the beginning of the show telling the cast, 5 minutes till the show begins. And Dan Schneider eventually was promoted to executive producer at the end of season 3. Essentially, Dan Schneider was the main creative engine that made all that run. And all that really marked the beginning of Dan Schneider's career as a television producer, creator, and contributor to the Nickelodeon live-action comedy shows throughout the 90s, 2000s, and even to today. Now, I know we've talked about all that for an extensive length of time, and I'm sorry for some of you if I bored you with all these details, but now we're going to jump ahead and quickly describe the next shows, the subsequent shows that Dan Schneider created and produced that really also left a lasting mark on Nickelodeon even until now. And these later shows really developed what I would like to call the Dan Schneider Nickelodeon family tree, or the All That family tree, because many of these shows were essentially spin-offs of All That, and some of the cast members and some of the actors who later starred in these other shows got their careers started in All That. So after All That started its run, the producers noticed that these two particular actors, Kenan Thompson and Kel Mitchell, really developed some great chemistry on set. They tended to play well off of each other. So in 1996, they were given their own show called, appropriately, Keenan and Kell, and that ran for 4 seasons, premiering on July 15th, 1996 with the first episode, and ending exactly to the day 4 years later, July 15th, 2000, with the TV movie called Two Heads Are Better Than None. Essentially, if you don't know what that movie was about, in a nutshell, Kenan's family goes on a cross-country road trip. Kel ends up joining them, even though the family didn't really want him to go because he was causing a lot of trouble. He was known for causing a lot of trouble. They ended up having their car broke down, and they needed to get help from somebody who actually turned out to be the Headless Knight, who lived in a town called Rockville, and Kenan and Kell had to get themselves out of a scary situation in order to survive. The show Kenan and Kell was known for mainly 3 things that would eventually become pop culture icons in the 90s. One, mainly Kel's love for orange soda. Also, number 2, Kel's other catchphrase that he would begin and end each episode with, "Aw, here it goes." And the prevalence of Coolio, who was a big hip-hop rapper at the time who performed the Keenan and Kell theme song. Now, in my personal opinion, Keenan and Kell ranks number 2 on my list of probably the top 5 Dan Schneider shows, mainly because their chemistry on set, just like in All That, was hilarious. The dynamic between the two just blended well together. We had one who was a complete opposite of the other. Kenan usually came up with these crazy schemes to either get rich or to make it to the top, like in the theme song. Well, Kel was a little bit, I want to say, probably less bright. He always tried his best to worsen the situation or to create bad situations where they had to try to get out of it, and in the process of getting out of it, hilarity would ensue. But also, this was an opportunity for us to see Kenan and Kell really as themselves. After playing many characters on All That, this is where they really had the opportunity to shine themselves as who they truly were. That's just my opinion. After Kenan and Kell started, Dan Schneider and the producers of All That wanted to go ahead and take one of their most famous sketches from the show and turn it into a full feature film, and that's what they did with Good Burger in 1997, with Kel Mitchell reprising his role as Ed, along with Kenan playing the role of Dexter, his new employee, co-worker. The movie premiered on July 25th, 1997, and reached number 5 in the box office, grossing about $23.7 million. And this was the first feature film for Kel. He would later go on and play a character in the movie Mystery Men. Good Burger was Kenan's second movie of his career. Before this movie, he played Russ Tyler in D2, The Mighty Ducks, which came out in 94. But now let's move on to the third spin-off of All That, which featured Amanda Bynes, and that was called, appropriately, The Amanda Show, which debuted in 1999. This show premiered as a pilot on April 4th, 1999, which I believe was Easter Sunday of that year, but didn't come on as an official series until October 16th, 1999. And at the time, All That was in its 5th season. And believe it or not, Amanda Bynes was able to do both. She was able to star in her own show, along with continuing on with the cast of All That. Also keep in mind, at this time, some of the original cast members, including Angelique Bates, Alyssa Reyes, Katrina Johnson, left the show at this point, and that was before Amanda was cast in season 3. And so we had a lot of rotating cast members in and out. But beside the point, The Amanda Show premiered on October 16th, 1999, and ran for 3 seasons, ending in 2002. It had a lot of sketches, just like All That, but it was really meant to be Amanda's version of the Carol Burnett Show. And there were a lot of notable sketches in this one, including Judge Trudy, the parody of Judge Judy. We also had Amanda's Jacuzzi, along with a parody of Who Wants to Be a Millionaire. Actually, if you didn't know, the name of the sketch was called So Do You Want to Win $5? And of course, we had a lot of family sitcom parodies, including The Klutzes, The Literals, The Simeons, and The Extremes. And another show, or another mini show within a show, that premiered later on during the later seasons of The Amanda Show, Moody's Point, which was created by Dan Schneider as a parody of teen drama series that were popular in the 90s, mainly Dawson's Creek. Moody's Point made its on-air debut on July 29th, 2000, and ran for 7 to 8 episodes. The Moody's Point sketch eventually ended on May 18th, 2002, where the plot of the story was left at a cliffhanger. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, the plot of that final episode involved Moody trying to find a new toe, or trying to find her dad's toe after it was severed from his foot because it was, due to an anchor dropping on his foot. Anyway, we eventually found out that Moody was not related to her parents at all, and the final scene of the episode was the Moody we knew, who was played by Amanda Bynes, being taken away or going with her biological parents, and the real Moody being introduced to us. But the show faded to black. The episode ended before we could see any further part of that. The Amanda show itself was ultimately canceled 4 episodes later on September 21st, 2002, with the last episode. And it was that point where Dan Schneider wanted to create another spin-off series just on Moody's Point. He pitched the idea to Nickelodeon, but they ended up not really liking the idea. So the entire story and plot of Moody's Point was eventually scrapped. And from this day forward, we still don't know what happened to the plot that was left at a cliffhanger all those years ago. 15 years ago. Wow. Can't believe it's been that time. But anyway, Dan Schneider needed to move on, and he decided to take 2 cast members from The Amanda Show who got their debuts on that show, Drake Bell and Josh Peck. And if Josh Peck sounds familiar, he also starred on the Nickelodeon movie Snow Day along with the 2001 film Max Keeble's Big Move. Anyway, Dan Schneider put those 2 together in the spirit of Keenan and Kell, almost like Kenan and Kell, and created their own show called Drake and Josh, which premiered in 2004. This show made its on-air debut on January 11th, 2004, and went until September 16th, 2007. The theme song for Drake and Josh was written and performed by Drake Bell and was called Found a Way. And Drake Bell was a singer and a musician at the time. Probably still is now. I don't really know. The essential premise of Drake and Josh, not unlike Keenan and Kell, was really the adventures of these 2 brothers who spent their life together and dealt with all types of issues, got themselves into all these different situations, but also did a lot of crazy and wacky things, which just made the show very funny and very interesting to watch at the same time. In addition to that, we also had one other member of the Amanda Show join the cast of Drake and Josh, Nancy Sullivan, who played the mom opposite Jonathan Goldstein playing the dad. Drake and Josh would be the debut show for Miranda Cosgrove, who played Drake and Josh's sister, Megan. She would later go on, after Drake and Josh was canceled, to be on her own show, which was called iCarly. Now, iCarly premiered on September 8th, 2007, ran for 5 years, 7 seasons, with it wrapping up its run on November 23rd, 2012. And essentially this show was about Carly, played by Miranda Cosgrove, running a web series of various live streams, essentially live broadcasts from inside their studio, where they would do all types of crazy things. Now, personally, this time frame, I also started to move away from Nickelodeon, trying to watch other shows, and I just felt as though, beginning with iCarly, the content, the premises of the shows, the acting, all these crazy things that the cast would get into at this point in time, I just felt as though it was too much for me, and I started to watch less and less of Dan Schneider's productions until recently, and we'll get into that a little bit later on. But I forgot to mention, before iCarly and after Drake and Josh, there was this other Dan Schneider show that I did really get into, and I liked a lot, and that premiered in 2005, and it featured Jamie Lynn Spears, which was the younger sister of pop singing sensation Britney Spears. The name of that show was called Zoey 101, which premiered on January 9th, 2005, and ran for 4 seasons until May 2nd of 2008. And the way that this came about was perhaps twofold. One, during one of the later seasons of All That, Jamie Lynn Spears appeared as a cast member of All That, which had now been relaunched. The original cast consisting of Keenan and Kell, Amanda, Josh Server, Elisa Reyes, Angelique Bates, Katrina Johnson, Leon Frierson, Christy Knowings, Danny Tamborelli, Lori Beth Denberg. They all finished their careers with All That at the end of season 6. The show went into hiatus for just a little bit and was relaunched with a whole new cast, including Lisa Foyles, Chelsea Brummett, Kyle Sullivan, Jack DeSena, along with, at the conclusion of the Are You All That contest, when they tried to find a kid, they debuted it as, or they branded it as the search for the funniest kid in America. The winner of that contest was Christina Kirkman, who joined the cast, I believe, in season 9 or 10, and then the runner-up, Ryan Coleman. Oh yes, we also had Giovanni Samuels and Shane Lyons join the relaunch cast as well. Getting to the point, Britney Spears appeared on All That so many times, and eventually her younger sister, Jamie Lynn, appeared as a regular cast member, and not far after that, Dan Schneider came up with another spin-off show which would bring her into the limelight, and that's how Zoey 101 was formed. A second interesting fact about Zoey 101 was also the fact that this show served as the successor, the replacement for the Moody's Point TV series that sprang off of the Amanda Show. You may recall me saying how the original Moody's Point sketch left at a cliffhanger, and the higher-ups at Nickelodeon really didn't like the idea of a whole spin-off series based on Moody's Point. So essentially Dan Schneider came full circle and reincarnated Moody's Point. Essentially the whole premise of Moody's Point and put it as a new show, which essentially became Zoey 101. And so you see how everything comes full circle, and you'll also see it later on in Dan Schneider's more recent shows. Now, to keep the chain moving, at the beginning of Season 2 of Zoey 101, which, interestingly enough, premiered on the 4th anniversary of 9/11, September 11, 2005, there was a new cast member by the name of Victoria Justice, who played Lola, one of Zoey's new roommates. She would later go on to have her own show called Victorious, which premiered in 2010. And that show I didn't really get much into. That's when I stopped watching Nickelodeon, and I was far gone from watching Nickelodeon at the time. I was watching other networks. March 27th, 2010, Victorious premiered and went on until February 2nd, 2013. One thing that you may note about this show is especially Victorious marked the acting career debut of now pop singer Ariana Grande, who played Kat Valentine. And it's interesting else to note that we had this character Kat, who essentially was a reincarnation of Misty Raines from Moody's Point, who was another of Moody's friends. She had a catchphrase in Moody's Point, "What's that supposed to mean?" which was transferred over to Kat's character. Kat would later get her own show, or another show spun off from Victorious, called Sam and Cat, which also starred Jeanette McCurdy, who played Sam in iCarly. You can see now how many of the different characters would transfer over to other shows in the same Dan Schneider universe. Sam and Cat, essentially a show about the two title characters running a babysitting service, ended in just over a year. On July 17th, 2014, the show was canceled. And that, at the time, put an end to the All That spin-off family tree, as there were no other characters afterwards, at least for the time being, that were branched off of cast members originally on All That or other shows. And it seemed that way at the time, because then another superhero show came along called Henry Danger, which essentially featured this superhero by the name of Captain Man, who needed a sidekick by the name of Kid Danger, and they could never disclose their real identities. Henry Danger was created by Dan Schneider and Dana Olson and premiered on Nickelodeon on July 26, 2014, and it stars Jace Norman as Kid Danger, or his real name of Henry Hart, Cooper Barnes as Captain Man, along with Riel Downs as his friend Charlotte, Sean Ryan Fox as Jasper, and Ella Anderson as Piper. And Henry Danger had no connections to All That. No connections whatsoever. This show completely had a brand new cast, which had nothing to do with the previous shows that were spun off of All That. But things came along in the following year that resurrected the All That family tree again with the launch of a new show that Dan Schneider created in 2015 called Game Shakers. Now, this show, which I really like and I'm beginning to warm up to, it's one of my most favorite shows on Nickelodeon airing right now. Debuted on September 12th, 2015, and it starred two 7th grade girls played by Cree Kachino and Madison Shipman, respectively. They developed a game called Sky Whale, which was essentially a mobile game app as a science project. And lo and behold, their game took off and really became a hit. And so, as a result of that, they decided to go in together to create their own game design company. Their names, by the way, are Babe and Kenzie. Babe, played by Cree Cicchino, and Kenzie, played by Madison Shipman. Other cast members include Benjamin Lil Peanut Flores Jr., who plays Triple G, the son of Double G, played by the one and only Kel Mitchell, who at this point in his career made a full circle return to Nickelodeon, the network where he got his big start. On top of that, who would have thought that Kel would make not only this return to Nickelodeon, but now have two, not just one, but two spin-off shows under his belt, resulting from his initial success on all that. Of course, you'll remember his first spin-off was with Keenan. That's just amazing. And to get a full feature movie on top of that with the Good Burger movie, wow. Kel's character, Double G, is a hip-hop mogul and rapper whose song was used without his permission on the game, the first game that the Game Shakers created. So he went to sue him, but the Game Shaker said, no, wait a minute, you can be our business partner. And they've created games, all types of games, which you could actually download off of Nick.com or off of the various app stores, including both iPhone, iOS, and Android. Now, Game Shakers resurrects the All That family tree, with Kel being in the show as Double G. And personally, I really like this show a lot. Mainly, it brings my two interests together. One, I am a big fan of games. I love to play games, and I've also designed my own game, so I know what it's like to make a game and get it out to the people and have it being tested. And also, number two, because I love Kel's acting style, his comedic techniques, his comedic approach. I watch the show now, and I feel as though Kel's doing his thing, the same thing that he did back in the 90s and the 2000s. And, of course, now Kel's character has two bodyguards by the name of Bunny and Ruthless, who are also his best friends. But, yes, and those two characters are played by Shell Bailey and Bubba Ganter. So, even though those two characters were added in, Kel's still doing his thing, and watching him on Game Shakers now reminds me of completely what he did back in All That, and Kenan and Kell. There are even some subtle references to his old shows that I was able to pick up. For example, he did say, "Aw, here we go," at the end of the first episode, which is an obvious reference to Aw, Here It Goes. I think there was even one reference to orange soda in that. And Kel's acting style in Game Shakers is very similar to the way he portrays Coach Creighton. In the way that he yells and gets all crazy and really brings out the Coach Creighton in him more as Double G in this show. But personal opinions aside, the show is still going strong, and they've renewed it already for a third season. The one thing that I would like to see this show do is at least bring back Kenan for at least one episode, maybe just as a special guest star appearance. I feel he needs to come back because the dynamic duo of Kenan and Kell was so great, as I mentioned earlier, and I just feel it would just add more excitement to the show and bring back that nostalgia for Kenan and Kell to team up again together. I mean, they already did the Good Burger sketch reunion on The Tonight Show starring Jimmy Fallon back in 2015, but this would mark Kenan and Kell's first appearance on a Nickelodeon show since the 10th anniversary episode of All That back in 2005. And as for the last episode, I've gone on way too long. It's time to wrap up. I've essentially given you a chronology, a history of Dan Schneider's shows that he produced and created for Nickelodeon. As you can see, it's a long list. Dan Schneider to date has created 10 comedy shows, sitcoms and sketch comedy shows for Nickelodeon over a span of at least 20 years. 21 years. And I say that's a long time. Getting into Dan Schneider's legacy, I can say that Dan Schneider has created a lot of iconic hits that defined Nickelodeon's programming, especially in terms of the live action shows that Nickelodeon is known for. I mean, All That, Keenan and Kell, The Amanda Show, even newer shows like Victorious, Sam and Cat, even though I don't like them very much, Game Shakers now. I mean, Dan Schneider shows launched the careers of many stars, including Kenan Thompson. He's on SNL now. Ariana Grande, obviously, she started as Cat Valentine in Victorious, now is a pop music superstar, as well as Amanda Bynes, who went on to do hit movies such as What I Like About You, What a Girl Wants. Actually, What I Like About You was a TV series, excuse me. But regardless, What a Girl Wants. This other movie which is drawing a blank. Oh yes, Big Fat Liar, Hairspray. Now she at least is coming out with her own fashion line. She did kind of get herself into a little bit of trouble, almost falling into what we call the Nickelodeon equivalent of Lindsay Lohan. But I'm not going to get into it. That's another story for another time. We also had so many different actors and actresses coming out of Dan Schneider's shows, which really was a launch pad into the start of their other careers as well. I mean, also including Danny Tamborelli, who is now continuing to do sketch comedy in another show called, I think, Man Boobs. And then Lisa Foyles, who I recently saw, she has her own YouTube channel doing great things for YouTube where I accidentally saw her interview Katrina Johnson and Elisa Reyes, who were the original cast members of All That. She also organized an All That reunion at this convention by the name of Kamikaze, where they were able to bring in all, or at least various members of All That from the original and the reboot cast. And so the legacy of All That, which was Dan Schneider's first endeavor, lives on. Okay, I've talked long enough. It's time for me to wrap up. But before I go, I'm going to ask you now, what was or what is your favorite Dan Schneider shows, and how would you rank them from 1 to 10? Personally, I would start with All That at number 1, followed by Keenan and Kell, and then Game Shakers. And then to round out the top 5, I would probably put Drake and Josh and the Amanda Show, and then probably number 6 or 10, in no particular order, would be iCarly, Victorious, Zoey 101, Henry Danger, and Sam and Cat. And most importantly, how do you feel as though Dan Schneider left a legacy for Nickelodeon? I'd love to hear from you. Please leave your thoughts in the comments below. And this wraps up another edition of the Nickospective podcast, and thank you for listening.